Hello everyone, my name is Amanda Archibald. I am the principal and founder of the Genomic Kitchen. And today I'm going to talk about genes and mood and answer some of the questions some of you may have about, do the genes I have or the genes I've inherited impact my mood? Are they responsible for mood swings or moodiness, anxiety, depression, not being able to focus, insomnia, etc., etc.? And if my genes are affecting me, is there something I can do with food or nutrition? So at this point, before we go any further, I want to make it very clear that my work is in the interpretation of DNA information and how I can correlate that with nutrients and food, your diet, exercise to the extent I have information and insights there. But that being said, if you're someone who's really been struggling with mood, anxiety, really not sure from one day to the next which end is up, it's really important that you talk with a licensed healthcare provider or behavioral therapist or your doctor, all of these individuals having expertise in that space. I am not an expert in behavioral therapy or in helping you correct anxiety or mood swings or depression if there is a medical component. So please do not wait if that is you. That being said, come on with me if you're curious about what do you know about genes and how can they influence mood and what can you do about it anyway. So we're going to start then with genes, and just so we're all on the same sheet of music here, let's recall what genes do. So genes contain a specific recipe to make a specific protein, kind of like making a chocolate cake. You might need a very specific set of ingredients depending on the type of chocolate cake you're going to make. So proteins are important because they are the building blocks of the body. They're what I call the infrastructure. So think of bones and muscle, for example, infrastructure. But they're also what I call the construction workers and the movers and shakers. So if you're building a house and you deliver all the construction materials are delivered to the building site or the construction site, you need experts to be able to put the frame of the house together, to put the roof on, so shingles or what have you, or roof tiles. You need the plumbers, the electricians, the drywallers, the plasterers, you name it. All of these individuals are integral to how you build a house. Those integral experts would also be proteins, but we call them enzymes. So we need genes to help build your body, essentially. Genes are the blueprint that design your body. But genes are not always on their best behavior, as you're going to find out. We all have pretty much the same genes, but what creates the variance between us, or what we call traits, are things called SNPs, SNP. We call them variants. You may know them as single nucleotide polymorphisms. We all have polymorphisms. That's what makes us different. But sometimes those polymorphisms, particularly when we're looking at communicating hormones in the brain, can be a little bit of a rabble-rouser. So we want to know who's got rabble-rousing genes and who doesn't, and if you have them, so what? Okay? So genes, before we go any further, and this is a very, very important point. Many of you who followed my work know that I say genes don't predict, they don't diagnose, and the other thing is they don't operate in a vacuum. So regardless of what type of genes, we all have pretty much the same genes, right? Regardless of what flavor or color your genes are, they don't operate in a vacuum. I say that there's nature and this nurture. So nature are, if you will, the genes you've inherited, but nurture is the environment that kind of runs over or cuddles or huddles or dashes by your genes. In other words, it's not just about the genes you inherit, but it's also about the food that you eat. Do you have enough information from the food that you eat for your genes to do their work and for the proteins that they produce to do their work? Are you in a situation, very highly stressed situation? Maybe you live in isolation. Maybe you don't like your job right now. That's what I call nurture. All of those factors can also influence whether your genes are turned on and off or whether they're just going to play quietly by themselves or whether they're going to pick a fight in the sandbox. So there's nature and there's nurture. And there's also, as you note here, other genes that are in the sandbox. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to show you in a moment. But for today's presentation, or as you're listening here, I'm mostly going to focus in on, excuse me, two brain hormones, or we call them neurotransmitters or chemical molecules in your brain called dopamine and serotonin. And I absolutely love this chart. You can find it here at this URL because I think it really helps us understand, those of us who are visual learners, really understand what combination of our different brain hormones are connected to genes, okay? What different combinations can manifest in different outcomes. And this is just a representation. Remember, genes don't predict or diagnose. This is observational. So if we look here, I'm going to start on the right-hand side. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are your fight or flight hormones. They're the ones that come out. They say, whoop, hey, not a great situation. House is on fire, or, car not running as well. You probably want to get out of it before something happens. These are the hormones, or we call them catecholamines. And you may also know them as adrenaline outside the United States. But these are the hormones that, or communication molecules that respond to stress. Hence why, if we look at our test tubes here, we can see that norepinephrine, epinephrine are at the highest levels in a stress situation. You want that, right? But you don't want it all the time. The next one we're looking at is love. And look at this, we've got equitable or equal levels of dopamine, serotonin, which we're going to focus on today, and oxytocin, where oxytocin is the connecting hormone. It's the one that helps a mother connect to their child, so the child latches on, or baby latches on, if you will. It's the lover, it's the huddler, it's the cuddler. So for love, can you see that we have equitable or equal levels, if you will, of all three of these hormones? In depression, you can see that dopamine and serotonin are also at play here, but can you see how their levels are at the bottom of the test tube? Happiness, lovely high levels of serotonin, another cuddling, good mood, feel good, communicating hormone. Look here, kind of different angle. We're looking at mood and affect, if you will. In anxiety, can you see that there's no balancing serotonin and very low levels of dopamine? Because dopamine, as you're going to find out, is the communicating molecule. We're going to call it neurotransmitter. That is the clap on the back. It's a clap on the back. It's like the job well done hormone, okay, or communicating molecule. And if no one's out there to slap you on the back, you sit there and say, well, what's wrong with me? Am I doing something wrong? So you see here, dopamine is very, very low. But in schizophrenia, where, people can really, really don't feel completely balanced, so there may be one mood one day or one affect the next. Can you see that dopamine levels are super high here? So the bottom line is that these neurotransmitter or communicating molecules that are present in the brain can influence all these different emotions that we may put under the hood of mood. So is there a genetic component? Yes, there is. Aha. So let me show you, these are just snapshots of a part of a genetic report that I work with called 3x4, 3x4. These are all random panels that are pulled, so do not think that they belong to you. If you look at anything, you can see, and I'm not going to get into the nomenclature too much here, but you can see that these are from 5 completely different reports. The way that the genes line up, it looks like computer code, doesn't it, are all different. What is the makeup of this individual and which genes are top of mind in this part of the report, where we're looking at genes that impact movement and behavior, is completely different from over here. So what are we looking at here? And I'm going to make this super fast because this is not a lecture or presentation, you understanding each and every gene that we look at throughout the human body. Okay, but I made a point over here that when we're looking at dopamine, and it's very important to understand this, dopamine, which you're going to get into, which is your slap on the back, risk reward, job well done, communicated in the brain. Dopamine itself is a molecule. It's a chemical molecule. In order for it to signal or have any impact in the brain, it needs to dock onto a receptor. And those receptors are called DRD receptors. There's actually 5 of them. In the report I'm working with here, we're only looking at 4. So there's a big difference. Let me just back up here. There's a difference in the degree of impact of those receptors, but they all work together. We all have the receptors. The challenge is that some of the receptors work better than others. Sometimes none of them work super well. Sometimes they work too well, which creates a higher demand for dopamine in the brain. But what I want to show you here is I'm looking at this random report here. Here we have an individual, and the purple means high impact. It means, maybe those receptors aren't showing up and playing nicely in the sandbox. And maybe there's some other stuff going along here with other genes that we're looking at that can make these genes or these receptors even grumpier. So just to go back, dopamine is a hormone. Okay, it's a communicating molecule. For it to communicate, it has to dock onto its receptors, kind of like a lock and key. If the key doesn't fit very well, then maybe we're going to have some issues with dopamine getting into the brain and doing what it's supposed to do. So that's what we see sometimes with individuals. You can see here, this individual, okay, 2 and 3 are probably working great. They're not even showing up here. But 1 and 4, where 1 is actually probably the most important dopamine receptors, maybe it just needs a little bit of a kick in the pants to do its job, okay? If we look over here, a little lower down, can you see there's 3 dopamine receptors lit up, which means potentially with that individual, there may be some issues with dopamine kind of locking onto the receptors and getting into the cell. That individual may be somebody who has higher blood dopamine levels because they're not able to get in, bind to those receptors, and do what they're supposed to do. We'll talk about the difference between high and low dopamine in a moment. The other thing here is you see this gene HGR1A. This is our serotonin receptor. Serotonin is produced in the gut, and 95% of it is produced 95% of it is produced in the gut, but it's also produced in the brain. It also needs a receptor. So this purple is suggesting, maybe potentially with that individual, there's an issue with serotonin docking. Remember what I said at the beginning of the presentation. Just because you have a SNP doesn't mean to say that that gene is or isn't working properly. In fact, what I said is genes don't predict, they don't diagnose. They give us, for clinically, they give us a signpost. They give us questions, say, hey, how are you feeling? How are you sleeping? Any anxiety? Are you somebody who could get up tomorrow and run a marathon and in the afternoon say, who's going to go for a hike? Is that you? Or is it not you? So when we're looking at this code, if you will, from genes, it's not diagnosing and predicting, it's having us ask questions to see whether the genes are playing out with how somebody presents themselves, things they may have on their mind, be concerned about or not. The final thing here, and you can see this again, 5 different parts of 5 different reports, all looking at mood and behavior, if you will, that same panel, 5 different reports. You can see the makeup or what's lit up and what's not is completely different. But over here, this gene, to the point about genes play in a sandbox, how many of them are in the sandbox and how many of them playing nice together? So the CHRNA5, when you see this form of the gene, sometimes that can really get and prod at dopamine saying, hey, you know what, it sort of amps them saying, you know, if you are already somebody who's like over the top, you know, kind of almost outlandish, going out there and doing your marathon, 1 marathon a week, or I would not say that's outlandish, that's commitment. But, you know, people who are like, can be totally off the wall. If you add CHRNA5, that can just amp the behavior. So genes don't work in isolation, okay? And depending on who's in the neighborhood, you may see more kind of influence on a gene pattern, or you may see less. We don't necessarily know. But reading this, so you know, I read this almost like a code, and understanding what these genes do gives me an idea of some of the questions I may ask someone with respect to their mood, balanced mood, maybe kind of a little bit up and down, and also their behavior. Are they aggressive? Are they super loud? Are they super talkative? Are they quiet as a mouse? Are they motivated? Do they have a hard time focusing? All of this gives us insights potentially into somebody's mood stability, and behavior. So on that note, let's talk about dopamine. And you've heard me talk about this already a little bit. It's the reward brain hormone. Another word for brain hormone is neurotransmitter. We like to think of it as being the good job, slack on the back, motivator hormone. It gives you that high and that pleasure of achievement. It's like, yeah, kind of like endorphins, like, woohoo, did it, what's next, right? Or thrill seekers, you know, you may be a great mountain biker and you know, you cycle, get to the top of the hill and wham, you know, some people are going to go down cautiously. Others are going to jump over, you know, do pivots in the air, you know, hit rocks, you know, jump off cliffs. That's not me. These are people who maybe they're thrill seekers, but if we look underneath the cover at their genes, they may have their, you know, dopamine receptors set for, you know, gimme, 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 gimme. Or the dopamine receptors are looking around saying, where's the dopamine? I better go find some. I better go find some. I better go find some because I'm seeking the thrill and I can't get enough of the thrill. And sometimes we see that in those variants in those dopamine receptors. So to the point here, some people are thrill seekers. Others simply can't find the motivation to get off the couch. And the question is, what creates the difference there? Why are some people, you know, they're all right on the couch, and others like, I can't sit still. That may be you, maybe your spouse, maybe your kids or your grandkids. So we know then that dopamine is a communication molecule. So first of all, you gotta make dopamine for it to do anything, okay? So you need nutrients to make it, and you also need nutrients to break it down. So what I'm showing you here is these are all the nutrients. If we were to put them in the mixing bowl of dopamine production and getting rid of dopamine, these are all the nutrients we need. It's a slew, you know, and see vitamin D's in there. Okay, very topical right now, but how many of you have heard of molybdenum? Did you know that copper was needed to break down dopamine? It's amazing, isn't it? And the base amino acid, so that's a building block for protein that we need for dopamine, is tyrosine. And here's some of the foods that you can find tyrosine in. So as I say here, you can't make or break down dopamine if you don't have the nutrient cofactors. So that's where I may come in from a dietary perspective and say, okay, does your body have what it needs to be able to produce dopamine and break it down? And there's something really, really interesting about dopamine when we're talking about breaking it down and getting rid of it. So you need a bunch of nutrients to make dopamine and get rid of it because the body needs a balance. And as you heard already, dopamine requires receptors to bind it. DRD1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Each receptor is encoded by a specific DRD gene, as you saw in the report. But variants in those DRD receptors can change whether dopamine, the chemical, can bind to the receptor and get into the cells, and if it can't, then it's sort of, you can have very high levels or higher levels in the bloodstream that can impact you. Other variants, particularly the 3 version or the DRD3 variant in the gene, can actually make sure dopamine gets into the cell, but it doesn't get released. So then you're also looking around saying, hey, wait a minute here. Where's the dopamine, people? You know, we're making it, I get it, but then it kind of gets bunged up in the cell. So it's always interesting. Are you making dopamine? Is it getting bound? Is it getting stuck in serum in the blood? Or are you releasing it too fast? So genes can really impact kind of the neighborhood of how we utilize, take into the cell and get rid of dopamine. Genes can be rabble rousers sometimes, but they don't diagnose and they don't predict. So what's the difference between the highs and the lows here? So when you have produced too much dopamine and you can't get rid of it, maybe it doesn't get into the cell. This is where you see the people who can tend towards addiction. By addiction, I'm not necessarily talking about, you know, drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, although that definitely plays in. But these can also be the thrill seekers, you know, the constantly, you know, getting that high. So having dopamine high, what I actually see with individuals is they can a lot of times sleep a lot less. Some people, even though they're not sleeping as well, actually don't want any more sleep. They're fine. There's some unique individuals in this world who actually can function on very little sleep. That's not the case for most people. That's more the exception than the rule. Okay, so too much dopamine, it's like these are people, as I said, that can be kind of almost outlandish, fast talkers, super thrill seekers, off the wall, like, oh my gosh, how did you do that? Okay, are you gonna sit down like kids? You need them to sit on their hands, you know. But some of these people that can also kind of move into addiction, so chemical addiction. And you know, these might also be people, it's like, can you please just sit down, sit on your hands, like kids who can't sit still there. They can almost become irritable as well. So for these people, so dopamine, very high levels of dopamine can lead people to thrill seeking because they simply can't get enough of it. The flip, and the other thing that's very interesting with high levels of dopamine, the real kind of sort of highest end of probably that's not the right way to say it, but the most overt signs of way too much dopamine, if you're going to stray into the medical realm, maybe tics. The flip side of it, because dopamine is also involved in locomotion, so coordinating movement, coordinating thoughts, focus, and attention. So when you have very, very, very low levels, and we stray into the medical side, that may be associated with Parkinson's. So obviously, those are the extremes, and most people fit in between, or somewhere to the left or somewhere to the right. So I like this graphic here that comes from the brain, the OHSU Brain Institutes. You can look this up. And the only reason I'm showing this is not to talk about low dopamine and Parkinson's, but just to show you how dopamine binds to receptors. So here you see lots of dopamine in the little purple molecules here. And you can see that via the receptor, they're able to get into the cell. So there's plenty of dopamine getting into the cell. In this case, very low amounts of dopamine are being produced and transmitted into the cell. So these are normal levels. You may see in people who have very high dopamine levels or poor dopamine receptors, a ton of dopamine not actually in the cell, so outside of the cell. So that will be the difference between somebody who has too higher levels, a healthy, quote, balanced person. We all teeter-totter, right? And then someone who literally can't get dopamine to the cell, and that really affects their locomotion and thought processes, etc. So how can dopamine get to be so high, and what are some of the signs? We've already described some of them, but here to talk about mood. Very high levels of dopamine can be associated with high libido, anxiety because it's like you can't get rid of it, difficulty sleeping because you can't calm your mind, like monkey mind, a lot of energy. Remember I said that kids need to sit on their hands. The far extremes would be mania, but it can also be associated with stress, but super interesting, improved ability to focus and learn. So there's all these kind of spaces along the spectrum, and it is unique to each individual. So some people who are like I think super gifted athletes, for example, can get up and, do crazy mountain biking feats, come back and take like an advanced neurology exam. They may have very high levels of dopamine, but it's not an extreme for them. So that's an example of high dopamine levels. But one of the things I pointed out to you is maybe you have very high levels of dopamine because you can't get them into your cell. That's a dopamine receptor issue. But one of the dopamine receptors is also, it works a little bit differently in that it'll actually hang on and hug dopamine and not necessarily release it. Then you're also looking around, well, okay, so where's the dopamine? So dopamine is this really, really interesting molecule. When we're looking at it in terms of DNA, whether it's impacting your mood, we kind of see the patterns in the receptors. We see the nutrients that are required for dopamine. But a lot of times, it's really a conversation with you as an individual. It helps us understand what may be going on. And then, of course, we don't guess from genes. We always validate if we think there may be some issues with uptake or production or release of dopamine. We can actually see that in nutrient testing and lab testing. So we never guess what's going on. And again, I only work from the nutrition perspective and certainly not from a medical perspective. So again, if you feel you're somebody who's like bouncing all over the place, please do discuss that with a professional who has the expertise to help you understand that. So as I said, some people may have a problem releasing dopamine. Or guess what? And this is super, super interesting to the point that genes work. There's lots of genes in the neighborhood. They do not work in isolation. That sometimes there's issues with dopamine because dopamine has to share the space in your body with lots of other genes. I'm going to show you that in a moment. And there's one other factor that we consider with dopamine, and it's a gene that many of you may have heard of, but you're not quite sure how it works. And this gene is called the COMT gene, the co-methyltransferase gene. So let's see what's going on here. So we know that dopamine can play a role in your motivation, focus, whether you may be bouncing off the wall, taking a lot of risks, or having a hard time getting off the couch. Regardless, dopamine has to share with its neighbors and it has to play nicely in the sandbox. So let me take you on a little journey here. And I know for many of you, this may be gobbledygook, but I just want to show you that how dopamine is made and how we can start to break it down. It gets to be fascinating. So dopamine, we often think of the building block for dopamine is tyrosine, but tyrosine can be biotransformed or created, if you will, from phenylalanine. So this is an amino acid. So what you're seeing here, and I've highlighted this in yellow, is all these yellows are genes that are involved in making proteins or enzymes that allow you to make tyrosine, to make dopamine. See, there's 4 steps to making dopamine here. There's another way you can make a dopamine, and that's from tyramines. And tyramine you find in fermented foods as well. So we've made dopamine. Can you see there's what we call rate-limiting steps, or I've highlighted genes that create enzymes that help you make dopamine. But dopamine, so once we've got dopamine, we've also got to break it down because the body's always seeking balance. Can you see that there's other enzymes or genes that make enzymes that help you break down dopamine? So assuming everything's working perfectly, and I was just showing you dopamine receptors, look how many other genes are involved in the production of dopamine, but also in breaking it down, okay? So we won't go into what all the steps are here, but what I want to show you here is this a central gene that's involved in breaking down dopamine called co-methyltransferase. Some of you know that as COMT. So I'm just showing you another little panel here, looking at all the different genes that we look at to assess mood and behavior. And again, we're only talking about dopamine here. Okay, so what about that COMT gene? Let's just go back a moment. I was pointing out that COMT is really important for breaking down dopamine. So, couple of things here. You can have a fast comp gene, or you can have a slow comp gene. And this is important because we want to create a balance for dopamine. If you have a fast comp gene, next to the comp gene in your panel, it would say GG. GG, these are the alleles. They are kind of the part of the gene, or the type of the gene you inherit from your parents. 1G from your mom, 1G from your dad. Okay, in this case, we've got G from dad and A from mom. So the gene's functioning as it should. What happens if that gene works really, really fast? That means that if the comp gene works really fast, it can potentially drain dopamine really fast. And if you're a fast drainer of dopamine, my experience has been that you may be an individual, you can eating great, exercise, you may be meditating, but you are just unmotivated, couldn't care less. Even though you're a smart and intelligent individual, you're like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Sometimes that's accompanied by weight gain and poor sleep, and you have no idea what's going on. When we look at your genes, one of the things we might look at is, are you binding dopamine and are you getting rid of it fast? Because your body basically doesn't have enough dopamine potentially for you to be motivated, to focus, to be able to do a crossword or what have you. So we're not just looking at dopamine genes, we also look at comp. What happens if you have a slow comp gene? Here it may say AA, maybe. Okay, a slow comp gene means you've got a pileup in dopamine. You know, it's either a pileup in the blood or it's a pileup in your cells, and you're like, okay, what do I do with all this stuff? I got this excess, I can't get rid of it. It's like cleaning out your house and nobody will come and pick up the trash, or you know, the thrift shop. If you remember times maybe recently where you got to the thrift shop and they're like, everyone's cleaning out already, we can't take any more. What happens if you have a slow gene, a comp gene? It means that you could end up with a dopamine pileup. A dopamine pileup can really make you irritable, anxious, can potentially explain insomnia, mood swings, or you may become even more of a risk taker. Like, wait a minute, didn't you just go out and mountain bike all afternoon? Now you're going to parachute? So, and for some people, it can actually drive addictive behaviors because you're constantly looking for the risk and reward, and you can't get it because there's a pileup in your dopamine. You can't get it out of your cells. It's just not talking, and you're like, okay, help, help. So fast comp gene can drain dopamine really fast. Slow can cause a pileup, and that can impact individuals differently. So we talked about high can be very aggressive, irritable, can cause moodiness, anxiety, insomnia, or just like kind of really risky behavior. But the flip is dopamine, and this is a lovely graphic. I want you to be aware it's from Return to Health. So signs that your dopamine is low. Like I said, lack of zest for life. You're not able to feel happy or pleasure. You don't have motivation. You just can't be bothered. A lot of apathy may procrastinate. Now, do not blame low dopamine because you can't be bothered to do something. That's completely different. You may have low libido. You're just kind of dragging around, and you know, the synaptic gaps aren't firing. You may have memory loss. So you can see here, you're like, wait a minute. So is there a difference between dopamine and maybe the ApoE4 gene? And well, now I have questions. So what's going on with me? Genes do not work by themselves. Low dopamine does not predict anything. It just helps us understand from a genetic perspective, are any genes at play that may explain how you feel? What can cause low dopamine? Those dopamine receptors are not working efficiently. Maybe you don't have enough nutrient building blocks to make dopamine. That's where my work comes in. And maybe you have that really fast draining comp gene, acetylmethyltransferase. It's like, gimme, 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 gimme. I'm going to get rid of, you know, as fast as you deal the card, I'm going to, you know, deal them out. And I need another set of cards and deal, 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 deal. So in my experience, we definitely see, but not that often, some people have a really fast comp gene. And if that's the case, what we can actually do is stack more nutrient building blocks in the funnel so that you have enough food information to build dopamine and kind of put a plug in the hole, if you will, so we can slow down the draining of dopamine by giving you enough food information, nutrient information to build it, to offset how fast that downstream COMT gene is working. So it's fascinating to see. But there's one final thing. So dopamine is interesting, isn't it? Spent a lot of time talking about it here. But it's fascinating because if you realize that you can never put your finger on one thing in the body, say, see, it's that gene or it's that nutrient. There's so much that goes into how you build information in the body, how it's communicated, how you release it. Okay, but there's one final thing, and I think this is fascinating because I've been talking about the COMT gene, fast or slow, right? But those fight or flight hormones, remember epinephrine and norepinephrine that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation? To break down your fight or flight hormones, they also need COMT. So dopamine needs COMT and your fight or flight hormones. So think about this. If you're super stressed all the time, okay, which many of us are, you're producing a bunch of those fight or flight hormones. To break them down, if you don't break them down, you may have similar symptoms having too much dopamine, like you're amped all the time and you're jittery and you can't sit down and you can't focus, or maybe you can focus for a short period of time, then you've got to run out and get a high, from your mountain bike, or maybe, going to the gym or whatever. But stress requires COMT. Dopamine requires COMT. There's only so much COMT. Okay, there's only so much co-methyltransferase to go around, and so what happens if you have a fast form of COMT? Yeah, maybe you can break down the stress hormones fast. Maybe you can break down the dopamine fast. What happens if it's slow? You don't break down your fight or flight hormones. Your blood pressure goes up or stays up. Your blood sugars go up or stay up, and you are just amped. You're irritable, you can't sleep. That makes you even more anxious, which makes your blood pressure stay up. It drives more blood sugar, it drives more demand for carbohydrates, so your blood sugar could go up, and you get caught in this vicious cycle. It's fascinating, isn't it? The body is amazing. Genes don't play on their own. They play in neighborhoods, but sometimes they're calling to 2 streets over for all hands on deck because there's a problem in this neighborhood. Genes don't predict, they don't diagnose. They help us understand an individual's makeup, maybe some of what they're going through, but they don't diagnose. They just help us understand scenarios. So I just mentioned fight or flight hormones. And cortisol is that other communicating molecule that can amp your fight or flight hormones. And I love this graphic. It's from Frontiers in Endocrinology. Those of you who are not scientists don't need to dash over here. But the bottom line is cortisol is one of the C's we want to manage. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to have you just take a quick look at Dr. Robert Lustig's work and then go and look at his work in the 4 C's. But in his work on the 4 C's, which will make a lot of sense after this conversation with you, one of the things he talks about is C is for cortisol. And cortisol is one of the things we want to manage, because what does cortisol do? When you amp cortisol, basically you kind of set in motion not only those fight or flight hormones, but elevated levels of constantly elevated levels of cortisol do not work well in your favor. They can reduce the production of adiponectin, which is a master switch to help you burn fat and burn carbohydrate. When you switch on cortisol, we see over time reduced burning of fat. Who doesn't want to burn fat, right? Or adipose tissue? Who doesn't want to activate your fat burning mechanisms? Who doesn't want to have a sensitive insulin molecule that helps you get rid of sort of roaming blood sugars in your blood? Who doesn't want to prevent bone loss? Cortisol can actually downregulate or turn off the protein osteocalcin that helps you bind calcium to your cells. Cortisol is required for a fight or a flight, but unfortunately many of us have elevated levels of cortisol, which are reversing the very mechanisms in your body you want to turn on. burning carbohydrate efficiently, smooth as silk blood sugars, sticking calcium to your bone, right? Not losing bone, burning fat preferentially, building muscle mass, and on and on. Cortisol is a doozy. Okay. So what happens when we end up with like all this collision course? Like I said, you can have poor dopamine binding. You may not have enough nutrients in the neighborhood to make dopamine. You may have too many fight or flight, too much of a stressful scenario. So you're asking your body to, get rid of fight or flight hormones at the same time as you're trying to get rid of dopamine. And guess what? This is what your body looks like when there's too many demands on its genes. It looks like a biochemical pileup or road, what you call this traffic jam, okay? Bad day on the road. This is what your body looks like if we don't huddle and cuddle your genes and give them the information that they need, okay? So, too many demands on the body can create some really testy genes. So going back here, just to the point I was just talking about those fight or flight hormones. Here you have norepinephrine and epinephrine. You can see the very elevated levels, which are associated with cortisol. Amp the cortisol, you'll amp the norepinephrine and epinephrine. So your catecholamines, or your adrenaline and noradrenaline genes or molecules. You see very high levels are associated with stress. Very high levels of dopamine, super high levels, can be associated with tics, schizophrenia, really outlandish behavior or back and forth behavior. Low levels associated with anxiety, poor locomotion, poor focus, planning, memory, recall. But then we have serotonin, the contentment. Can you see the contentment and happiness communicator? See in our test tube, it's full up. We want to fill our cup brimming with serotonin because too little is associated with depressive symptoms because it's your feel good, your good mood, your hugger and cuddling communicator. So if you don't have hugs and cuddles, how do you feel? Okay. So what's interesting is there's kind of an inverse relationship between dopamine and serotonin. So too high levels of dopamine can drive down serotonin like a seesaw. The body always wants to seek balance, optimal balance. And sometimes genetically we can be a little bit higher or lower. The receptor that's involved with serotonin uptake to the cell is the HTR1A. HITRA, what did I just say? HITRA, the HITRA receptor. And sometimes with that receptor, there's variants or SNPs on that receptor. It can impact serotonin uptake. But the thing is, serotonin, it's 95% of it's made in the gut. But serotonin also has nutrient, we call them precursors, or nutrient building blocks, such as tryptophan, that need to be in place so you can make it and break it or break it down. So make and break requires amino acids or proteins, requires very specific nutrients. So you can't get away with the same 10 foods and think that your body's going to work harmoniously and that your moods are going to be perfectly balanced. You're kidding yourself. Okay, so there's a balance, this conversation between dopamine and serotonin, but notice again that persistent stress can deplete both dopamine and serotonin. So here we go. This is the serotonin receptor gene, HTR1A. Variants or inefficiencies in this gene can alter serotonin. So I love this. It's from the developinghumanbrain.org. What does low serotonin feel like? You can have, similar to dopamine when you're really out of whack, very high levels of anxiety, can have depression too. It can be associated with depression because you just don't feel good. Remember, it's your good mood, love hormone. Cravings for sweets, fatigue, migraines and headaches, many things feed into migraines and headaches, not just serotonin. Okay. Yes, it's associated with digestive issues, low self-esteem, unusual pain sensitivity, which is very interesting. This is not the only gene that we look at where we can see some association with pain or pain receptor perception of pain, which is very interesting. Mood swings, insomnia, okay? Serotonin, like you've heard me say, is made in the gut. A poor gut is a poor brain because 95% of serotonin can be manufactured in the gut. So what happens if you make a bunch of serotonin, but you don't absorb it well because your gut's in disarray? Not great, huh? 95%, maybe you're at 60%. So for some individuals, when you just don't feel right, you're like, I'm just not who I am, or I don't feel like great on a daily basis. I'm missing that great feeling I had 3 years ago. Sometimes it can be as simple as restoring the efficiency of your gut so your body has the ability to absorb the information it needs to do its busy to do its business on a day-to-day basis. It is its own operating system. It needs information. Most of that information is coming from food. And if it can't get through or past your gut, or it's only like little bits at a time, only so many aircraft can be on a runway at any one time, right? Imagine the backup when, air traffic control shuts down, you can't take off. Same with serotonin. You can't expect your brain to communicate efficiently if the information can't get onto the runway, the other side of your gut wall. So the gut, you are what you absorb. And given that so much serotonin is made in the gut, really important that you make it and it can get through the gut wall. And of course, if you got a poor diet, all bets are off for serotonin production. So this is a lovely kind of graphic. Please let me just make sure you see where this comes from, pitherapy.com.au. Lovely graphic, and basically it's showing how serotonin is made. See this? Tryptophan is the founding nutrient or amino acid. Where do we find it? Here's examples. These are some of the best sources or the most robust sources of this particular amino acid. So you can do something about making serotonin just by making sure you have a really good diet. Let me tell you something. Two of the most useful foods you can have in your freezer or refrigerator, because they are nuts and seeds, which are high fat contents, are pumpkin seed and sesame seeds. Robust sources of nutrients. If you do nothing else, put those in your refrigerator or freezer, or, I'm not saying eat a whole bag all at once, but all nuts and seeds have great source of information. If I were to tease them out, these two come to the top for me. So you need the base information, tryptophan. Then it's biotransformed into an intermediary molecule, 5-HTP, that many of you have heard about. Sometimes this is given as a supplement. Okay, why not start with the food and give it the right information? And then from here, we can produce serotonin. But what's important, can you see how many nutrients are involved in, we call them cofactors. You've got vitamins and minerals here that are involved in making serotonin. Don't kid yourself. You can bypass things or just kind of eke by with a pretty pathetic diet. You can't. Mother Nature pretty much provides you with all the information your body needs to function. Some of us may need a little bit more help with certain foods. Some of us, because of inefficiencies in our genes, need a little bit of supplement support, little bit, to bring the body to efficiency. And there's no efficiency in the body if the gut doesn't work, period. You can take all the supplements you want, but the gut is the make or break, okay? That is what helps your body absorb. No absorb, doesn't matter how much you try to externally put in your body in the forms of supplements or whatever. They'll just mask the issue. See down here, how's dopamine made? Here's our base molecule, tyrosine. Again, look at the nutrients that are involved, okay, to make it. And by the way, dopamine is a precursor to your fight or flight hormone, noradrenaline or norepinephrine. So noradrenaline in Australia, norepinephrine in the United States. So you need base information. You've got to be able to absorb it, regardless of your genes. And you need the cofactors or helpers to take these molecules and transform them into the target communicating molecules we need. You've got to be able to make dopamine and serotonin. You got to be able to break it down. The body always seeks balance. So one final thing before I get to the lovely work of Dr. Robert Lustig is, what about GABA? Because people ask about, well, GABA, isn't that the good mood neurotransmitter or hormone transmitter or communicating molecule. Yeah, it's another calming, good mood, help you feel at ease molecule. So GABA requires a receptor to take it up, get it into the cells. And there is a gene, the GABA2 gene. And I'm just showing you just of what we know right now. There's probably many, many genes that we're going to discover in science that are involved with dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, GABA that we don't even know about yet, or they haven't been studied to the extent that could say, yep, we know exactly how that works. Therefore, this is potentially the relationship it would have with your mood or anxiety, what have you. So GABA requires a GABA2 receptor. There can be variants on the receptor that can also modulate the efficiency of the uptake of GABA. GABA is the great soother. It helps mediate mood, anxiety, and panic, I should say, and it's a panic mediator as well. So yeah, GABA is right at play there. But again, if you've got some inefficiencies with the receptor, just like dopamine, it can just change the levels. Okay, so the body always has ways to work around inefficiencies, but again, you've got to have the base nutrient building blocks and your gut has to be in working order so we can shoot the information through to your body, through into your body and see whether you have what you need to make and break down your neurotransmitters. So on that note, what I want to come to is regardless of when we're looking at genetics, and your genes can, as you can hear, for me, they can influence how your body handles certain information and nutrients. But they're also bathed by the environment that we put them in. So Dr. Robert Lustig, and I want to draw your attention to his website here. So robertlustig.com/4Cs has a wonderful infographic and website that helps us understand that even though food is a part of how we manage our mental health and cognitive health and mental well-being, there's other very, very important variables you need to consider. And he calls them the 4 C's of happiness: connect, contribute, cope, and cook. So cook is really what we've been looking at mostly today in terms of your genes respond to the information we give to them. So cooking, or maybe growing or purchasing and putting your own food on your plate, ensures that your genes and the proteins they produce have the food information they need to function. Just go back and replay this video and look at the slide where I said, look how many nutrients dopamine requires to make it and break it down. Serotonin requires a bunch of nutrients and the base amino acid tryptophan to be able to be built, let alone break it down. So you can't do that if you don't have a good diet. How do you own your diet? Cook, people, cook. So cooking is, it's an act of beauty for your body. It's an act of signaling to your body, I care. I care, therefore I'm going to give you what you need. So that's cooking. But cooking is also a way to connect to people, to share with food, to share in conversation. And that brings us to the first C of the 4. Fourth was cook. So the first is connect. When we connect, we raise oxytocin. When we connect with each other, we raise oxytocin, which is that bonding, loving hormone. And some people can have SNPs in the gene that produces this, but the bottom line is if you look at the research from the Blue Zones research says that there is a deep connection with longevity and the centenarians that they talked with for the research. And the connection piece, and this really hits very close to home for me, really, having grown up in Europe and spent so much time in the Mediterranean, is that in the Blue Zones research, the elders oftentimes have known the same people all their lives, since kindergarten. They've known them. Now, bear in mind, they may not have left their village or gone too far away, so of course you know people. But it's the idea of a community and connecting and be able to know the person that you bought your bread from, or if you went down and bought your seafood from in the Mediterranean we're talking about, okay, and around the world. It's about knowing the market stall vendor, okay, when you go and buy something. It's about knowing that every year there's certain anniversaries or village fairs you're going to go to, that you're going to connect with people that you've known for a long time. Connection is family, connection is friendship, and our genes like BDNF and oxytocin respond to connectivity. They respond to the huddle and the cuddle and the snuggle of connection. So never underestimate the power of connection. And we absolutely now know that isolation, people who live alone, people who live in isolation, often suffer from cognitive decline, depression, regardless of their genes, and often will die earlier than people that are connected. Our genes respond to love. Connection is important. Contribution, I think, is a beautiful part from Robert Lustig. He's talking about taking your focus off of yourself. Now you need to take care of yourself, but give to others. Get outside of yourself. Be altruistic. Volunteer. Dedicate your time to someone or something. Maybe it's a shelter. Maybe it's working with a pet shelter. Maybe it's working with the homeless. Maybe it's contributing to building mountain bike trails. Maybe it's contributing to cleaning up a highway. Give of yourself outside of yourself. And this also feeds into the idea of a sense of purpose, doing something outside of yourself, doing something you're committed to, or the concept of ikigai, which was also brought up in the Blue Zones, which is having an understanding of who you are, how you fit into this world, how you connect, and that you have a purpose. Super, super important. Lustig, also the third C is cope. Manage your environment. If you do feel that things are out of control, you're just not happy, you don't feel like you have your feet on the ground, again, evaluate that and reach out to get the help you need. Okay, so that's really, really important. But he also says, so manage your environment, manage your screen time, manage who you associate with. Make sure you exercise or move because it raises endorphins. It's kind of your natural dopamine, your natural highs. And it also increases something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. So exercise increases BDNF. BDNF loves exercise. Why is this important? Particularly for those people who may have lower dopamine levels, because BDNF helps you grow neurons. It helps you grow new pathways in your brain. It keeps your mind sharp. It keeps it open. It keeps you correcting or connecting these new pathways in your brain that help you think, help you build clarity in your mind, improve your memory. Everything is about keeping your brain and your mind as active and as happy as you can. So coping is really, Robert Lustig saying, take a look around, get yourself out of the bad situations, put yourself in a place where you focus on you, and put yourself in a better place, no matter how you get there. That's a really important pillar of happiness. And of course, cook, we talked about already. So the 4 C's of happiness, regardless of what I've talked about with genetics and building blocks and your gut, etc. These, I think, are beautiful pillars and infrastructure for you to understand how you can build these components into your life that also work beautifully with your genes. So again, check out Robert Lustig's work. He has a beautiful infographic that explains this, and you'll actually connect to some of what I've also been talking about in this talk with you. And so in summary then, let's talk about what I talked about. So genes encode, in terms of this presentation, for receptors that can impact how well you utilize and you release dopamine and serotonin. So that means that, your genes can play a role in communication hormone uptake and release as well. But importantly, nutrients also impact your ability to make these neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, and break them down. Genes never work by themselves, so other genes, such as CO-methyltransferase or the COMP gene, are in competition for dopamine. So you have a lot of stress. Guess what? Those genes require comp, so does dopamine. So there's a lot of competition for our genes, and if they're not working efficiently, that heightens the odds against, whether you're going to feel balanced or not, okay? These same genes will also compete for the nutrients that dopamine or serotonin need as well. A good diet and a good gut in working order is everything. As I showed you right at the beginning of the presentation, there are many other genes. One or two I did talk about, but many I didn't, that can influence your behavior, impulsivity, compulsivity, and mood swings. Depending on their variants, the form they're in, they can potentially heighten the sensations you receive from dopamine and serotonin or not. Okay, we never just look at one gene. We look at the neighborhood and the playground the genes play in. Very importantly, genes are one tool that a clinician like myself may consider to evaluate your serotonin and dopamine levels and other genes that may influence how you feel. They are one gene. We never work just with genetics. It's probably a very important tool in the clinical or medical toolbox, but it's not the only one by any means. We also never guess how your genes are influencing your mood. I may get a picture of what I think may be going on with your dopamine, but I would never say, here, start taking this supplement or talk to your doctor about that medication without laboratory validation. In fact, I personally will never talk to you about medication because it's not my scope of practice. But if we're looking at nutrients, I'm never going to suggest you start taking this nutrient or that nutrient until I know what your balance looks like. And 95% of the time, I'm going to say, you know what? If there's a little bit of an imbalance, we need to push a little harder on making sure you have enough copper or B6 or magnesium. We're going to look at food first. And only then, if you don't respond to food, we might just top up the food funnel with a little bit of supplemental support. But we don't start right off with supplements. And we don't guess, okay? Finally, gene information and nutrition provides very useful insights into your mood and brain connection. But they don't diagnose, as I said, and they do not replace medical advice or behavioral therapy. So I hope you found this information interesting. DNA gives us such great insights into what may be going on with an individual. It tells us what questions to ask, where to look. It helps you understand what might be going on. But it's only one tool. We don't guess, but it's extremely insightful. So I hope you found this useful information. If you have any questions, please send me a note to amanda@genomickitchen.com. Thank you so much for listening.